All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into some seriously heavy philosophical territory today. For all you philosophy fans out there, get ready to grapple with some truly mind-bending stuff. We're talking about Immanuel Kant's Transcendental Idealism.
That's right. You know, this isn't just some dusty old theory. Transcendental idealism has had a huge impact on how we understand reality, knowledge, all sorts of fundamental questions.
Absolutely. And we've got a fantastic guide for this journey. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Kant's Transcendental Idealism. I mean, the SEP, that's the gold standard, right? Really in-depth, comprehensive analyses, so we're in good hands.
We're going to try to cover a lot of ground in this deep dive. First, we'll break down the basics of Kant's Transcendental Idealism. Then we'll explore some of the main interpretations, the debates, the puzzles it raises. We're really going to dig deep into the philosophical implications.
Perfect. So let's jump right into it. One of the most surprising, maybe even shocking things about Kant's work, especially from his critique of pure reason, is his claim about space and time. He says they aren't like things in themselves or properties of things as they exist independently of us.
Yeah, it's a real head spinner when you first encounter it. Kant's saying that space and time aren't objective features of the world out there, but rather they are forms of our sensible intuition. They're like the lens through which we experience everything.
So it's not that there's a world structured by space and time and our minds just sort of passively receive that information. It's more like our minds actually impose this space-time structure onto our experience.
Exactly. It's a radical shift in perspective. Our minds aren't just mirrors reflecting reality. They're actively shaping it through these forms of intuition.
Whoa. And it gets even wilder, right? Kant says the objects we encounter in the world, our coffee cups, trees, those aren't things in themselves either. They're appearances.
Yep. And get this. Even when you look inward, when you introspect on your own thoughts and feelings, those are still appearances. You're not directly experiencing your mind in itself, your soul, or whatever you want to call it. You're experiencing those mental states as they appear to you in time.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, what Kant's saying is, all we can really know are these appearances, these things that show up in our experience, structured by space and time. Things in themselves, the ultimate reality behind it all, that's off limits to our knowledge.
You got it.
Yeah.
Kant's not saying we can't think about things in themselves. We have concepts, categories like causality, substance. We can use those to think about what might be beyond our experience.
Okay, so we can speculate, theorize, but we can't really know in the true sense of the word.
Right. It's like we can have a concept of a cause, but we can never truly know the cause in itself that lies behind a specific event. We can only know how events appear to us as causally related within our experience.
And these mysterious things in themselves, they're not just sitting out there doing nothing, right? Kant says they actually affect our sensibility. They're what gives rise to these appearances in the first place.
Right. That's the idea of affection, and it's caused a lot of debate. It's tricky, right? How can something we can't know be the cause of our experience?
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher. So to be clear, here's how Kant defines transcendental idealism in the Critique. He says, and I'm quoting here, that appearances are to be regarded as nothing existing outside our minds but mere representations, and that space and time are only sensible forms of our intuition, not determinations given as existing by themselves or conditions of objects as things in themselves.
It's a pretty dense definition, but it captures the essence of his theory. It's all about how our minds actively structure our experience through these forms of intuition, and how what we perceive are ultimately representations, not the things in themselves.
It's revolutionary, really. And of course, it raises a whole bunch of questions that philosophers have been wrestling with ever since.
Oh yeah, big questions about the nature of appearances, the nature of things in themselves, and how they relate to each other.
I mean, those are like the fundamental questions, right? What is real? What can we know? Kant throws a whole new wrench into the works.
He sure does. And to make things even more interesting, he contrasts his transcendental idealism with other views that were popular at the time.
So first up, we have transcendental realism. This is the idea that space and time exist independently of us, they're objective, and appearances are just things in themselves as we perceive them.
Kant saw that as the default view, the common prejudice, as he called it. But for him, it just didn't explain how our minds shape our experience.
Right. It assumes this kind of naive realism where we're just passively observing an already structured world.
Exactly. Then there's empirical idealism, where the focus is on our own minds and mental states. The existence of external objects becomes uncertain or even denied altogether.
Kant gives examples like Berkeley, who he calls a dogmatic idealist, because Berkeley straight up denies mind-independent objects. And then there's Descartes, who Kant calls a problematic idealist, because Descartes questions our ability to know the external world for sure.
Kant wants to distinguish himself from both of these. He's not trying to say that the external world doesn't exist or that we can't know anything about it.
But he is saying that it exists and is knowable in a very specific way, right? As appearances structured by our minds.
Exactly. In fact, he even says that transcendental idealism is a form of empirical realism.
Wait, hold on. Empirical realism, that sounds like a contradiction. How can idealism be a form of realism?
It seems counterintuitive, I know. But Kant's point is that we do have immediate and certain knowledge of objects in space, but that this knowledge is grounded in our self-consciousness, in our awareness of our own experience as spatially structured.
So it's not that we're directly perceiving mind-independent objects out there. It's more like our awareness of ourselves and the world implies the existence of those objects within our spatial framework.
You've got it. Our experience of the world and our experience of ourselves are interconnected. You can't have one without the other.
I think I'm starting to get it, but to be honest, I'm still a little confused about this whole external business.
Yeah, that's a tricky part. Kant makes a distinction between empirically external and transcendentally external.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference?
Empirically external refers to objects that we encounter in space, outside of our immediate mental states. So like the chair I'm sitting on, that's empirically external to my mind.
It's not just a thought or a figment of my imagination. Got it.
Right. But then there's transcendentally external, which refers to existence that's completely independent of our representations, independent of our minds altogether.
So things in themselves would be transcendentally external, but appearances, even though they're empirically external, they're not transcendentally external.
You got it. Appearances are still dependent on our minds for their form, for their existence within space and time.
So it's like the objects we experience are real, they're out there, but their out-there-ness is a product of how our minds are structured.
Precisely. Their existence as spatiotemporal objects is tied to our cognitive framework.
Kant, you are blowing my mind. And then, just to add another layer of complexity, he throws in the distinction between empirical appearance and empirical thing in itself. Is this getting too deep?
We can handle it.
Yeah.
It is another layer, yeah. Here, he's talking about two ways of considering the same object. The empirical appearance is how the object appears to us with all its particular contingent qualities, like its specific color, texture, and so on.
So like how my coffee mug looks from this exact angle with this particular lighting, that's its empirical appearance.
Right. The empirical thing in itself refers to the same object, but considered in terms of its more stable, intersubjectively valid properties. Properties that would be true for anyone perceiving it.
So like the shape of the mug, its solidity, those would be part of the empirical thing in itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These are properties that are grounded in the a priori forms of our experience. They're not just dependent on my particular perspective.
But even this empirical thing in itself, it's still an appearance in the transcendental sense, right?
That's right. Neither the empirical appearance nor the empirical thing in itself is the ultimate mind-independent reality of the object.
It all goes back to those forms of intuition.
Yep. They're always there shaping our experience.
Okay, so now that we've laid that groundwork, let's talk about how people reacted to Kant's ideas.
Oh, yeah. People went nuts.
As they should, right. This is radical stuff. The essay talks about a review by Feder and Garve back in 1782. They basically accused Kant of being a Berkeleyan phenomenalist.
It was a big deal. A lot of people at the time interpreted Kant as saying that objects in space are nothing more than our mental representations, which is pretty much what Berkeley argued.
And this wasn't just some fringe interpretation. It really took hold and influenced a lot of later philosophers.
Yeah, especially in Germany. So it's important to understand why people read Kant this way.
Well, to be fair, he does say some things that sound pretty phenomenalist. Like there's that line about outer objects being nothing other than mere representations of our sensibility.
Right. And he also says that external objects, bodies, are merely appearances, and therefore nothing other than a species of my representations. And when you consider that Kant uses representation, Verstellung, in a way that seems similar to Berkeley's use of ideas, it's understandable why people would draw that connection.
Yeah. Plus, you have those really strong statements in the A edition, like the one about the entire corporeal world vanishing if the thinking subject were removed. That definitely sounds like he's saying the world depends on us to exist.
I mean, on the face of it, it does sound that way. Like he's saying the being of objects is tied to our experiencing them. So the phenomenalist reading definitely had some textual support.
So the SCP breaks down phenomenalism into a few different types. You have identity phenomenalism, which is the idea that objects are literally identical to our representations. Then there's strong phenomenalism, where objects exist only because we represent them.
And then there's qualified phenomenalism, which is a bit more nuanced. It says that objects exist partly in virtue of our representations, but not entirely. Like maybe their basic physical properties are grounded in our representations, but there's still something more to them.
And Federer and Garve specifically attributed that first kind, identity phenomenalism, to Kant. So how did Kant himself respond to this whole phenomenalist accusation? What did he say in his Prolegomena?
Oh, he pushed back hard. He was like, no way, you guys are totally misinterpreting me. He was adamant that his idealism was about the form of our experience, not the matter.
Meaning the space and time stuff and the categories.
Right, those are the forms.
Yeah.
He said the matter, the raw content of our experience, that comes from things in themselves, from outside of us.
So he's saying we structure our experience, but the stuff we're structuring isn't just coming from our own minds.
Exactly. He calls this external source the supersensible ground of our experience. But he also says we can never know the true nature of this ground.
So it's like he's trying to find this middle ground between a purely subjective idealism, where we just make up reality, and a naive realism, where we just passively observe it.
Right. He's trying to carve out a space for the mind to play an active role in shaping our experience without saying that we're just making stuff up.
Okay, so it's all about the forms. But even so, the essay brings up some interesting points about Kant's attempt to distance himself from Berkeley.
Uh-huh. It suggests that maybe Kant's view of Berkeley was a bit of a caricature, and that his own idea of a noumenal cause could be interpreted as similar to Berkeley's God.
Because for Berkeley, it's ultimately God who's causing our ideas, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if Kant's critique of Berkeley wasn't totally accurate, then his attempt to differentiate himself might not be as convincing.
And the SCP also points out that even if Kant's right about the form-matter distinction, it doesn't necessarily rule out a qualified phenomenalist reading.
You could still say that the existence and properties of objects are at least partially constituted by our representations, even if the raw content comes from outside.
Interesting. So moving on to the B edition of the critique, Kant made some changes, maybe to address these misunderstandings. He even suggested critical idealism as a better label for his view.
He was trying to be more clear, for sure, but did those revisions actually settle the debate?
Debatable. Some people think the B edition shows a shift towards a more realist view, while others think it's basically the same.
The SCP mentions that even in the B edition, Kant keeps using language that identifies objects with representations.
Yeah, so he's still giving fodder to the phenomenalists.
It's like he just can't escape it.
He does add something new in the B edition, though. The refutation of idealism. He argues there that our consciousness of time, of how our inner states unfold in time, requires the existence of enduring objects outside of us.
It's a powerful argument. He's basically saying, look, we couldn't even have an experience of time without a world of stable external objects to provide a framework for it.
That seems like a pretty good counter-argument to anyone who says the external world doesn't exist.
It is, but the SEPI points out that the refutation is really aimed at what Kant calls dogmatic and problematic idealism.
Meaning those views that deny or seriously doubt the existence of the external world, like Berkeley's or Descartes?
Right, it's not necessarily targeting the more nuanced view of qualified phenomenalism.
Which says that, yeah, objects exist, but they owe their being and properties to our experience.
Exactly. A qualified phenomenalist could say, sure, we need a stable world of objects to experience time, but that doesn't mean those objects exist completely independent of our minds.
Okay, that makes sense. So the SEPI goes on to explore the interpretation of Kant as a qualified phenomenalist. This is where the content of our representations grounds the existence and properties of appearances, at least to some extent.
It's an attempt to bridge the gap between Kant's idealism and his commitment to empirical realism. It says, yes, our minds play a role, but it's not like we're just imagining everything.
It's more like Our representations are structured in a way that corresponds to or even constitutes the objects we experience.
Exactly.
And this leads to the concept of universal experience. This is the idea that there's a coherent, lawful interconnectedness of perceptions that goes beyond our individual subjective experiences.
So it's like a shared structure of experience that we all tap into.
The PSYP outlines a possible qualified phenomenalist reading where this universal experience is the most unified, lawful representation of objects in space and time. It's kind of like the objective world, but grounded in the totality of everyone's perceptions.
It's a way of trying to account for objectivity and intersubjectivity within a phenomenalist framework.
But there's still a lot of challenges, right? The Psypes mentions criticisms, like how can we be sure there's something that appears beyond just our representations?
Yeah, that's a classic objection. It just seems intuitive that there has to be something out there that our representations are about.
And what about the public nature of objects? If the world is just my representations, how come everyone else seems to experience the same things?
That's a tough one. And then there's the whole issue of primary and secondary qualities. Like, how can a phenomenalist account for the difference between properties that seem inherent to the object, like its shape, and those that seem more dependent on the perceiver, like its color? Science also poses a challenge. Scientific realism tells us a lot about the world, about things that we can't even perceive directly. How does that fit with phenomenalism?
And then there's the persistence of objects through time. If an object's existence depends on my representing it, what happens when I'm not looking at it? Does it just disappear?
Lots of questions to answer. The SAP briefly mentions some possible responses a qualified phenomenalist might offer.
Like, maybe they could appeal to a scientific view of universal experience where it aligns with our best scientific theories.
Right. That could help with things like unperceived objects and the primary-secondary quality distinction. But it's still a tricky business.
Okay, so let's move on to another major philosophical problem for Kant. F.H. Jacobi's famous objection about the thing in itself.
Ah, yes, Jacobi. He had that great quote, "Without the presupposition of the thing in itself, I cannot enter the critical system, and with that presupposition, I cannot remain in it."
What he's getting at is this tension between Kant saying things in themselves exist but are unknowable.
Right. How can we even say they exist if we can't know anything about them? And if we can't know anything about them, how can they possibly be the cause of our experience?
Which is what Kant says they are, right? Things in themselves affect our sensibility and give rise to appearances.
Exactly. That's the famous problem of affection. It's a real puzzle. If the things that affect us are appearances, then we're stuck in a circle because appearances are supposed to be the result of affection.
And if they're things in themselves, well, we're not supposed to be able to apply categories like causality to things in themselves. So we're in a bind either way.
You got it. Jacobi's really hitting on a potential inconsistency in Kant's system.
The SIP talks about how Kant tries to distinguish between the cognitive sense of the categories and their use in just thinking about things in themselves.
It's a subtle distinction, for sure. He's saying we can use the categories to think about things in themselves, but those thoughts don't have any objective validity. They don't give us knowledge.
But for a lot of philosophers, that doesn't really solve the problem. It seems like you need some justification to even think about things in themselves in a meaningful way.
Right. It's not enough to just say, oh, we can use the categories in a non-cognitive way. You need to have some reason to believe that there's something there to think about in the first place.
And Jacobi pushes this even further with his dilemma about whether the objects affecting sensibility are appearances or things in themselves.
He's leading to what's called the exclusion principle, this idea that an object can't be the cause of the very conditions that make its own existence possible.
Which seems to create a real problem for Kant. If appearances are dependent on our cognitive faculties, how can they also be the cause of those faculties?
Yeah, it's a tough one. So in response to these challenges, particularly the problems with phenomenalism and affection, the dual aspect view emerged.
This view says that the distinction between appearance and thing in itself isn't a distinction between two different kinds of objects.
It's more like two different ways of considering the same object.
Yeah.
Like two sides of the same coin.
So it's not two separate realms of being, but one reality viewed from two different perspectives.
Exactly. That way, you can say that appearances are mind-dependent, but they're still grounded in something real, something independent of our minds.
And the FET points out that Kant himself sometimes suggests this kind of dual aspect view. Like, there are passages where he says we can consider objects as they are for our experience and as they are in themselves.
Right. And those passages are key for the dual aspect interpretation. They suggest that the distinction isn't so much ontological about what kinds of things exist, but more epistemological or perspectival about how we know things.
It's like the same object can be both an appearance for us and a thing in itself. We just can't know it as a thing in itself because our minds are structured in a certain way.
That's the idea. Now, within the dual aspect view, there are different ways of fleshing it out. The SEP talks about epistemological readings and metaphysical readings.
What's the difference there?
Well, epistemological readings focus on the conditions of our knowledge, on how our minds work. A good example is Henry Allison's interpretation.
Allison talks about the discursive intellect, which means our minds have both sensible and conceptual faculties. And he emphasizes the role of epistemic conditions, like space, time, and the categories.
Right. His argument is that our experience is shaped by these conditions, by the way our minds are structured. So when we think about objects as objects of our knowledge, we can only think about them within the framework of space, time, and the categories.
But when we abstract away from those conditions and we try to think about objects independently of how we know them, we're thinking about them as things in themselves.
And from this epistemic perspective, things in themselves wouldn't necessarily be spatial or temporal.
Because space and time are conditions of our intuition, not conditions of reality in itself.
Exactly. So Allison's view leads to the conclusion that things in themselves are non-spatial.
But the CPAM mentions some objections to this reading, too.
Oh, yeah. There are a few. One is the triviality objection. It basically says that Allison's conclusion is kind of empty. If we just define things in themselves as non-spatial, because they're outside our spatial intuition, it doesn't really tell us anything interesting about them.
Right. It's just a matter of definition, not a substantive claim about their nature.
Another objection is that this whole idea of epistemic conditions actually presupposes a kind of realism.
Like, if there are conditions of our knowledge, doesn't that imply that there's something independent of us that we're trying to know?
Exactly. And then there's the issue of abstraction. How do we actually manage to abstract away from the conditions of our knowledge? Is that even possible?
It's a tricky philosophical move. And finally, there's the worry that Allison's reading makes things in themselves seem less fundamental than appearances.
Because appearances are what we actually experience. And things in themselves are just these abstract, non-spatial entities that we can barely even conceive of.
So it's like appearances become the primary reality, and things in themselves are just kind of shadowy figures lurking in the background.
Right. Allison has responses to these objections, of course, but they get pretty technical.
Okay, let's move on to the other type of dual aspect view, the metaphysical reading. The SEP gives Ray Langton's interpretation as an example.
Langton takes a different approach. She says that things in themselves are substances, and they have intrinsic properties.
Like essential qualities that belong to them in and of themselves.
Exactly. And she says that appearances are the same substances, but considered in terms of their extrinsic properties.
So the properties that depend on their relations to other things, including us.
Right. So, for example, a tree in itself might have the intrinsic property of being a certain kind of organism with a certain genetic makeup, but its appearance to us, its color, shape, those are extrinsic properties dependent on our perception.
Okay, that makes sense. So this view directly addresses the problem of how things in themselves can exist and have a nature even though we can't know them.
It's an elegant solution. Things in themselves have intrinsic properties that are real, but we only have access to them through their extrinsic properties, which are conditioned by our minds.
But doesn't Kant say that we can't know anything about relations between things and themselves?
He does, and that poses a challenge for Langton's view. If things in themselves are substances with intrinsic properties, wouldn't they have to stand in some kind of relation to each other?
Yeah, it seems like it. And if we can't know those relations, it's hard to see how we can have any meaningful concept of things in themselves as substances.
Right. Langton has argued that we can still have a concept of intrinsic properties without knowing the specific relations between things in themselves. But it's a subtle point.
Okay, so the SIPI moves on to the debate about one object versus two objects. This is about whether appearances and things in themselves are numerically identical.
It's another tricky question. The one-object view says it's the same entity being considered in two different ways, while the two-object view says they're distinct entities.
The SEP emphasizes that this debate can be really confusing because people sometimes talk about one-world and two-world interpretations.
Yeah, that can be misleading. The one-world view usually means that there's only one kind of reality, the phenomenal world, but we can think about it in two different ways.
And the two-world view usually means that there are two separate realms of being, the phenomenal and the noumenal.
But it's not always that clear-cut. Langton's view, for example, can be interpreted either way.
Right. If phenomena are literally the extrinsic properties of noumenal substances, then it seems like a one-object view.
But if talk of phenomena is just a way of referring to those substances as they appear to us, then it might be a two-object view.
And Langton herself leans towards a non-identity reading, so a two-object view.
I think that's because she wants to maintain a strong distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal. She sees them as having fundamentally different characteristics.
Okay, so last but not least, the Sepuyi tackles the whole issue of things in themselves, noumena, and the transcendental object.
This is where things get really metaphysical.
It starts by laying out how different interpretations understand things in themselves. Some phenomenalists see them as like mind-independent centers of force that cause our sensations.
We're like sources of energy or something.
Right. Epistemic views, like Allison's, see them as just objects considered apart from our particular way of intuiting them. And then metaphysical views, like Langton's, see them as substances with specific intrinsic properties.
Oh, lots of different ways of thinking about what these things in themselves might be.
Then the Sepuyi explains Kant's own distinction between phenomena and noumena.
He says phenomena are appearances as they are thought under the categories, under the concepts of our understanding.
So it's not just the raw sensory data, but the data organized and structured by our minds.
Exactly. And noumena can have two meanings. In the positive sense, a noumenon would be an object of a non-sensible intuition.
Like, if we could somehow perceive things directly without using our senses.
Right. But Kant says we humans don't have that capacity. So the positive sense of noumena is kind of hypothetical for us.
Okay, so what about the negative sense?
In the negative sense, a noumenon is just anything that's not an object of our sensible intuition.
So basically anything that's not spatial or temporal. And that connects to the concept of things in themselves, right?
Right. Things in themselves are noumena in this negative sense. But it's important to remember that the term thing in itself refers specifically to the ground of the existence of appearances.
While noumenon refers more broadly to the type of intuition that would be required to know something directly.
It's a subtle distinction. And finally, we have the transcendental object.
That's a whole other thing.
The SE describes it as the pure concept of an object in general. It's not a particular object, but the condition for the possibility of any object.
So it's like the most abstract concept of objectness.
Yeah, something like that. It's the something that all our representations are about, but we can never know it directly because it's purely conceptual.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Kant's transcendental idealism. I have to say, it's been a wild ride.
It's definitely a challenging but fascinating philosophical system. Kant really shakes up our understanding of reality and knowledge.
He forces us to question some of our most basic assumptions about how we experience the world.
Right. He makes us realize that our minds aren't just passive receivers of information. They're actively involved in shaping the very reality we perceive.
So for all you philosophy fans out there, I think the main takeaway is this. Kant's transcendental idealism shows us that the world as we know it is deeply intertwined with our own cognitive faculties. We can't just assume that what we see is what's really out there, independent of our minds.
And understanding the different interpretations of transcendental idealism can give us a deeper appreciation for these complex issues and how they continue to influence philosophical debates today.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought to leave you with. If our experience is so deeply involved in structuring the world we know, what are the implications for our understanding of truth, objectivity, and the limits of human knowledge? Could there be ways of knowing or experiencing the world that go beyond our current modes of intuition and understanding? Those are questions worth pondering, for sure.
They are, and we'll definitely be exploring more mind-bending philosophical topics in future deep dives.
So keep thinking, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.